The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I'm the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product leader. Welcome to tonight's webinar. Sorry, I was off to a little bit of a slow start there, a little upgrade action going on, always keeping it tense. It kind of works as I see people joining now. It always is funny. For those of you who know how, can you type in the question box that you can hear me? Just type in a question that you can hear me so I know I'm being heard, so I don't end up talking to myself. Great, beautiful. Thanks, everybody. All right, I'm going to jump right in, even though I still see people joining the webinar. Tonight's webinar is a WKO4 season review. I say this, I did the same type of review last year, and I made the same statement. I'll make it again. This is probably the hardest one to do. When you come down to analytics, it's when you're talking about physiology or when you're talking about modeling or the math or numbers or watts or whatever, there's a certain amount of science at the core of anything you do. That is an anchor to a presentation. So when you get on and you're teaching people, you can say, okay, here's that anchor and here's a process that you go about to achieving it. Season reviews and this type of review is different because it really is for a coach or for a self-coached athlete, it's a self-analytical tool that also partners as an analytical tool of communication to your athlete for those that are coaching. So it's kind of funny, right? The purpose is challenging because it's very moving. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact at this. Some of this I showed last year. There's just some things that are part of my philosophy and system that are just, they don't necessarily change because of time. And, there's a couple of things that I've learned and improved. What I really encourage people to do in this type of webinar where it's more art maybe than science is ask questions. So with that being said, always remember, you can ask questions as you go. All you need to do is you have a little arrow here, and this will open and close your box. And if you find questions, you can enter the question down here. And I actually see it. I run two screens. So sometimes I wander off, and it sounds like I'm not paying attention. It's when I read the other screen too much. But if I like to answer questions as we go so that I don't have to come back to like something I said a half an hour later and said, hey, this is it. I've also tried to shorten the webinars. The core ones that we have are good and they take longer explanation. What I'd like to do in the new series of webinars, I think we have 5 scheduled for the rest of the year, is really open up more to Q&A as users become more and more expert and capable of doing, let's call them the basics or the fundamentals. We want to see, and be here to answer questions and try to elevate to the next step. That doesn't mean there aren't some new users. I'll gladly take new user questions also. Final caveat, as always, just know that these are my opinions. It's so funny. It's going on today in the group and stuff like that to some degree. I'm just not a person who has to say, like, this is the way. I've been doing it too long. The reality is it's not like, physiology is a science and there's a physiological reality of the things we do. But that being said, it was funny. I was having a discussion with one of my athletes, a pretty good pro, and we were talking about a new strategy for next year and making some change. And she said to me, well, is this going to work? And I had to say, I think so. That's the plan, because the reality is, response to exercise stimuli is a very complex physiological thing. And it's not always just this or that. It often can be, other factors besides physiology. That's what makes part of the season review so hard. So let's jump right in. Here we go. First things first, when it comes to season reviews, and I'll show some demos of this, I highly, highly recommend that for every athlete, you set up time ranges based on some form of periodization. Linear periodization terminology tends to make it easiest because we all tend to think about linear periodization when we talk about periodization, which means you have a base and a build and a perform or a race phase. You could say 4 phases, even 2, but I really encourage you to break your season into phases that you're focused on. Your base might not be traditional. You might be doing reverse periodization. You might be doing a form of undulation. But what you'll find is your macro cycles, you have time ranges, whether it's 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 1 week, which really is a microcycle, but depends on how you look at it. You might be focused on something like some singular intent. So when you group your time data together like that, and then later on you review what's occurred, it actually will help you think about that reality. What was your intent? What were you trying to accomplish? And will make the review easier, as I will show you some examples of. Just remember, review really is a process. It's not a science. And basically, you start with an overview, and probably the key phase is the insight phase. It's funny. I spend a lot of time thinking about stuff because I have issues. It's just the way my brain works. Like I have to look at a lot of stuff. So I spend a lot of time before I do a season review or a one-on-one consult, looking back over years of data. I spend a lot of time just looking at the data. And then if something just even seems interesting, I'll look at deeper or look at something related. And what I'm looking for is things that give me insight, something that comes out and is sort of like an aha moment, or it's not always an aha moment right away. It just is like, that's interesting. And then you begin to drill in. What do you start to look for? Some type of cause and effect. Like I see an oddity, I see a great performance, a bad performance, a something that makes me look. I then search for cause and effect. Once I start seeing maybe cause and effect, I look for other pieces of data that can either test my hypothesis, which kind of formalizes out of that cause and effect search, and or just simply confirm it. When you think about insights isn't always that starting point of like learning things about yourself or your athletes. It's not always as obvious in the sense of we tend to think about just looking through data. I spend a lot of time rereading notes. It's funny. I said to the same athlete last night, is like, I want to crunch all your notes into a word map and show, certain words that come out a certain amount, you would learn a lot. That type of data is, the qualitative side of it really is very interesting. You might look at observation. You might look at emails and notes going back and forth and other communications. Performance itself sometimes gives excellent insight into, some physiological factors, not just beyond performance, and results. And I'll tell you what I mean by results. So I approach this a little differently, right? I'm going to do a generally live case study. This is, we'll call her Jane Ryder. She's a professional woman cyclist. She's a young pro, just starting out, living the dream. I only started working with her, I think in January, February this year. So it really does show, like my first review, kind of some of the thinking, even though, I didn't share the full review that I'll deliver to her, but it's interesting. I wonder if she would let me. And I do have permission to use her data. So the big challenge was she's coming off an injury that basically she had to deal with something from late last season and was off. We actually couldn't get back into training until about February. And her, she came to me really looking to get over this injury and avoid it and then get strong and obviously live the dream. So she sort of has a mixed training history. There's some things in her training history. She's not a U.S. citizen. She came up through a different federation program. The federation program was using some different philosophies of coaching than I might use. So I look back, there's some different history in here. So it actually gives a series of challenges. That being said, I also have some other slides where I might not have enough data on her to show you a little bit more background. So when I always start the review, I start with a goal review. If you think about what you're reviewing, right, it's pretty simple. You got to start with the goal. And when you do a goal review, and there's other webinars where I show you how to set goals or annual plan and stuff like that. But if you do a review, you're not just reviewing data for the sake of data and say, oh, you have really nice data. That's great. But that's not really what you're doing. You're actually taking a look at the goals that you collectively set with the athlete. And you're going to say, did we? And it's not you accomplish these goals. It's not the athlete accomplish these goals. It's did we accomplish these goals? If you wrote good goals, the review should start with a very simple point. The answer to the goals and the associated milestones is either yes or no. It's not something in between. And I say you have to say that up front because if you say, well, we sort of accomplished it, right? And then you go down the level of using analytics to try to review the season and figure out what went right or went wrong. You don't have the same clarity. You're not attacking the question clearly. But remember, goals, the way that we should write goals is you should really have some clear performance targets. What are you trying to accomplish? Some measurable, smart activities, and we're going to kind of review against these goals. So I'm going to show you one of Jane Ryder's. I softened this, but this will give you insight. If you're in my goal setting one in the annual plan webinar, I talked about doing rubrics and stuff like that. I do that for all of my athletes. So we tend to have some specific goals. So I'm going to generalize, but I'll leave the milestone specific so it will be clear to everybody. She had a goal. She wanted to win late season stage in a big race. All right, so that capital L is typo 1. Everybody count. I get 3 typos a presentation. So yeah, and we had a specific race in mind and blah, blah, blah. So I just kind of leaving it out to keep her anonymous. And then we had some key milestones to achieve that. She wanted to get her threshold over 270 watts. We wanted an FRC of 20 plus. We wanted a Pmax of 950. She is a sprinter. Well, she's actually more of a pursuit sprinter. And we also then looked for some specific performance targets. We wanted a 20-minute power climb at 280 watts plus. And we wanted 4-minute power climb after 1500 kilojoules of 360 watts plus. So she needed more steady state power. There was an identification phase, and we took a look at her historical power. She has some limiters the way she's a decent amount of fast twitch muscle and has got a pretty good pop, but her steady state needs to be stronger, and she needs to continue to raise her threshold to be a good professional racer. So, and she also has some fatigue issues. So she hasn't, the training processes in her history haven't really set her up to deal with fatigue. So we also had some specific goals about fatigue. And don't forget, we also had a skill goal. So I did put it in here just so it doesn't get lost. The skill goal, she isn't always comfortable moving around the peloton. So I had a skill goal that just no more tail gunning. She likes to sit at the back and look for the big opportunity, which is probably most people on this call know is wastes a lot of energy and isn't the smartest way to race. Sure, once you get really, really good at being in the pack and really, really good at moving around, sometimes being in the back isn't so bad, but until you get good at it, being in the back is bad. So we had these goals, and then what we're going to do is we're going to review against these. We had more goals, but I'm just going to pick one and try to take a look at it. So first step is, did we do it? Yes or no? Well, because we had measurable aspects in our goal and then our supporting milestones, I can kind of start with a screen like this. And yes, we did really well in the late stage race we wanted to do. She accomplished what she wanted to accomplish, which was great. We hit most of our key milestones except a general fatigue. I didn't have it in the first slide because it was kind of on a background thing, but I brought it up here to show an area where we didn't achieve success. So now we're saying, okay, we set some goals and we achieved a lot of them. And because we were injury recovery, we didn't push. I mean, we could have set the goals bars a little bit higher, but when you're coming back from the type of injury she had, you're not sure. So now the review really becomes about what led to that. Can we learn from the things that worked, and can we build on them for future success? Can we figure out some of the things that didn't work or we could have done better to further increase the success? Once we start down that road, there's a couple of categories I break things into. I start with compliance, right? And I only have 2 screens to show you here on compliance. One really is TrainingPeaks. So Dave Shell and the TrainingPeaks team have done a good job. I've had some influence here, which has been great because it makes my job easier. If you're not trying the new ATP and TrainingPeaks with your athletes, the fact now that you can manage it and you can use it as a basis and then build everything and it's connected to their account, I think really makes it easier. But I also point out it's one of the places I look at compliance. You can do this by TSS or by hours. I just grabbed an example. This isn't the same athlete. And this one's by hours. So I can just quickly get, as it unfolds, an idea of compliance. There's plenty of graphs and charts in WKL4 that have compliance, where you could look at what you planned versus what you or the athlete achieved. This is simply looking at the variation of duration, TSS, and distance. So when the bar's above, the athlete went further. When the bar's below, went longer. When the bar's below, they went shorter. When the green bar here is above, TSS was higher than planned. When it's below, it's lower than planned. Distance, that's because I don't tend to put distance in my workouts. So all of it looks high, right? But I don't put a base distance, so anything the athlete does is above. And then here you can see like a planned daily TSS versus an actual. That being said, I want to tell you a caveat about compliance. Compliance is a review. It's not a goal or an absolute. It's not like, wow, if they didn't make my compliance, they failed. I've never, and I mean never, written a plan that really has ended up playing out the way that I wrote it. Part of your job as a coach is to be able to understand the ebb and flow of a season. The goal, the plan that you write with the targets and the things that you're trying to accomplish, that's an anchor. But the reality is your skill and your ability as a coach is to ebb and flow with that anchor. That's, what you get paid for. So the reality is it's not like, oh, I'm going to go after this athlete in a review and say there's not enough compliance. But that being said, I've had and seen one or two situations. I haven't had this for years, but I bet you everybody's had one of the, at least this happened to them once. You get an athlete who doesn't do really any of the work, and then they're like, well, you're not helping me get faster. Well, the reality is it is good to have compliance because you'll be able to show them, well, yeah, I hear you. You might not be getting faster, but you're not actually doing the work. Let's dig in a little deeper. So here's something new. This is going to be what's old is new, sort of. But for me, as I've continued to evolve in the use of WKL4, I've kind of circled around for most of my athletes the establishment of some key metrics that I'm tracking as part of my time zones, phases, base, build, monthly, whatever I'm looking at, but some universal collection of them. So once I say, the athlete was generally compliant, it was pretty much what I expected, I start to look at the key metrics, start with the big picture. So for me, the key metrics, I start with a season review. So I tried to make these as big as possible. So sometimes it actually hurts because I don't show you the full screen, which makes the numbers small. But I just simply have in this, the 2017 season, you can always see it here, selected. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that. Remember, I always build base, build, race, and full season. So I always have my time ranges set up before I do these things. And what I have here, and I changed it at the last minute, took it out of order, and it's been bugging me, so I need to fix it at some point. But I start with performance metrics. So I'm looking at Pmax for the season, FTP, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, and 40 minute, and 60 minute NP. Whenever you see a P next to my charts, because if you guys want these charts, we're going to load them for you or send them to you. P means peak. I just don't like a lot of words in title. So these are the peak 1, 5, 20, 40, and 60 minute NP. What's bugging me is those are out of order, and it's going to bug me the whole I changed something last minute so I can make it a little fit the screen, and I flipped the order by mistake. So that's what I'm looking at is for performance metrics. So if you think about what the goals are, we had goals that I can look at this and start making check marks right off the bat. We hit goals. Some of these are performance metrics. I then tend to look at metabolic or energy system metrics. I don't track a lot here, even though I do a decent amount of review in those areas. And it depends when you say metabolic or energy system, that is an oversimplification. There's all kinds of crossover and other things there. So what I'm tracking in kilojoules is FRC. So there's FRC for the year. But I also look still, and it's funny, I was having a discussion with Dean last week about some coaching stuff, and we're just talking about performance. And we had the discussion about kilojoules, and kilojoules are kind of a lost art, and TSS is another great way to track it clearly. But there are a lot of insights to have about kilojoules. So I always look at max 30-minute kilojoules and max 60-minute kilojoules. You could also look at this in watts. I bet you people can easily convert it. That's how I do it if you look at the chart, because a joule and a watt are the same thing. And I'll explain that on another webinar, but probably pretty much everybody here gets that. Then I look at FR is my terminology for fatigue resistance, and I'm tracking. So you notice that I relate these back to my goals too. I don't have the exact same key metric for each athlete. I build the key metrics when we set the goal so I can track them as we're ongoing. Part of the reason she accomplished all of our milestones is we didn't just get to the end of the season and be like, hey crap, let's take a look at this. We were tracking it as we went. And we had some, here's a 5 and 20 minute after 1500 kilojoules. We have a time to exhaustion. We have a stamina. And then we have her VO2 max for the season. So we got a pretty good chunk of numbers. So now that you understand, I basically use that as an overview. I relate back to goals and I communicate with the athlete like, hey, here's your season or your phase or your microcycle or your macrocycle or whatever it is. The next thing I review is and here's where I'm command clicking my pre-choices. I'm kind of kicking myself for not at least showing a right-hand panel doing it, but I bet you everybody here pretty much understands. Basically, you can hold the command or control button down and I click on 2017 season, the 2017 base, the 2017 build, and 2017 race. And that'll put your screen into compare mode, meaning it'll rank these, it'll separate based on how you have zoom or separate set up, but it'll separate them and give you an ability to look at them. So now what I start to see is the unfolding of this season. And we start to see it pretty well. So I can look at the overall season number, but at Pmax, we see 748 to 773 and 947. Now here's a caveat. This season doesn't, because it was so short with her, and it's why I'm going to use Ed Jewel Rider, one of my sample people, because her build, because we had to shorten each macro stage so much. One macro, the build is it's really short. So when you constrain the model in that very short time, you got to be a little bit careful about the average that comes out of it. But her MFTP, you see, was growing all year long. And this, again, is because of the shortness why you'd expect to see that. But the periods are different. This is the full year. These short periods, it's not telling the full story. But now you start looking at the peak performance numbers, and we see the base, her 1 minute, this was her second test. She did a baseline test pre the season, but this was her second test. And look, at 1 minute, she actually got slower. So there's an insight, right? When I see that, I make a check on that. I make a note. I use index cards. They're sitting on my desk right now, right? And I'm like, okay, note, decline in 1 minute. Her 5 minute power went 328, 332, 352. Okay, that's a direction we like, so that's good. And that's actually a nice little step up. Her 60 minute NP went in this middle range. We did a short, very intensive build. We didn't race, and testing was limited. We were really pushing through hard on training to get caught up. But we went 251 to 283, 60 minute NP, great. 20 minute 217. Here, she'd been out and injured, hadn't been training much. 273, 280. So once she really got back on it, started rounding back in nicely. Comes up in the race season, and in racing, then her 40 minute goes to 252. You can see pretty much all her peaks except that 1 minute happened in the race phase. So that's pretty good. That means our periodization strategy and our targeting to perform well once we got to a race stage worked, right? So I know that. I don't want to keep doing this with you, but here you see the same with FRC. But look what happens with FRC. She tests when she's really fresh and she hits some good numbers. She's strong out of the gate. And then actually declines in FRC, which is sort of in relationship with our 1 minute, right? But yet that's just a result of something. Again, another check mark. So I need to look at that FRC. FRC actually went down throughout the season. And I'll tell you, I'll put it up here right now. She is a massive 1 minute capability. She didn't need a lot of FRC to win races. She could crush. She needed other things. So our focus was not on FRC for the season. As a matter of fact, we knew we would lose some going in. So the reality is, I already know the answer, in our discussion and review was, this is what we expected to happen. Then I look at her energy and look what she's using. She was able to deal with more kilojoules as she got fit. She could produce more kilojoules in a set period of time, which you'd expect to run in conjunction with watts. Her FRC got better. We didn't test in the base period because she was coming out of injury and I was a little nervous to test her out of fatigue, but you can definitely see it improving from here to here. And then TTE, again, this base, we had some oddities in the, not oddities, just the shortness, the time frame we're looking at if you had longer frames. Her stamina doesn't really change. She raced in the US circuit. Stamina is important, but it's not that big of a driver. Other things to be focused on. And you can see her VO2 max was going up throughout the season. So of course, I'm walking you guys through the basics and everybody probably right ahead of me, but the idea here is think about what this is giving you in a season review. You've just chunked it into digestible chunks. That's why you use periodization, right? You're breaking things down into manageable periods of time where you could understand the ebb and flow of the dose-response relationship within an athlete. This simple view, because it's based on the metrics of the goal, and I was tracking it as we were both tracking it as we were going forward, is an excellent emphasis for review. Now, I also always do a final review against the previous season. So I'm not going to go over them all. You can look at them. I'll send you the presentation later. Just email us at info@WKO4, or once the presentation goes online, I usually link it to there, but whatever works for you guys. So you can see all her numbers improved except her 1 minute power. She had a better 1 minute power in 2016 than 2017. But she pretty much improved from 5 minutes out. She was stronger across the board. Better energy management. In the end of the day, when you look at it full seasons, her kilojoules didn't change that much. What you do see is this oddity about fatigue resistance. She she had some odd, there was like 2 or 3 files where she combined multiple days. It was funny, we were just talking about this in the Facebook group, and it mucks everything up. So I'm not 100% sure where to cut the file. So in the end of the day, I don't. And that's the lesson I wanted to show you. And I preach this at times in the Facebook group. Be careful when you're just saying, oh, that's a series of bad data, or that should be one, I'm just going to merge everything together to be one big file. Later down the road, you end up regretting that time and time again. And this is one of these things. So we've lost some history. We don't have a good fatigue-resistant baseline in our history. So I received the question, is this chart in WKO4? No, this is not. But if you email us at info@WKO4.com, I'll send it. This is my personal chart, so just know it's got some customization in it, but I'll send it to you. And then you see TTE, stamina pretty much stayed the same, but her VO2 max went up. That was probably one of the bigger accomplishments, as you'll see coming up. So kudos, right, to the athlete. She did a lot of hard work. She improved. We had milestones in our goals, so we have measurable capability of reviewing. We had clear goals with measurable numbers, and now we're reviewing against those numbers. So once we do that, right, we start to drill down what created that, in this case, success and some failures. And failures is a strong word, but success and some room for improvement, some success and ongoing improvement, right? How do we build on it? Well, I typically start, and it's so funny, I want to caveat this right now. Because you have to put things in a presentation in order. There's a page 1, a page 2, a page 3. I don't always do things that way. As a matter of fact, I tend to explain it as top down, bottom up. Meaning I'm looking at a lot of stuff, and I tend to at first move around between a whole bunch of different pieces of data and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And I start honing in my thinking on these little insights. I make the list. Oh, look at that 1 minute data. Oh, look at this. Then I start honing in and go through things. So I'm going to present it because it's the easiest way to explain it. It's the way I have to turn slides. Like and it looks like first I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. The reality is I'm kind of doing it all at the same time, and there's overlap, and it's messy. It's art. It's part of the creative side of what we do. So you're kind of stirring it all around and looking at a bunch of things. So it doesn't review as clean and neat in the order I'm about to show. Training load, I start good old simple PMC. The PMC, has been around for a long time. Dr. Coggin did a great job of giving us a tool of measuring training load. I do keep some peaks in the average old PMC, and I just like a simple monthly summary. Everyone has this. Everyone's seen it. It's in a basic chart somewhere. This is not Emma, by the way. I shouldn't say her name. Yikes. This is not Jane Ryder. You didn't hear that. This is my Ed Jewel Ryder sample. I really don't use this because I use the more complex ones, which I'm about to show you. But I just want everybody to know you can run a very simple basic one and still get a lot of information. Personally, I use this one. It is in the cycling pack. If you guys haven't tried the cycling library, go in the library and just search cycling. I put a new cycling dashboard, which a lot of these things are in there, with new bests, and I just Debbie just added the William Renfro built the heat map. All that's in there. So it's in the library. Go into your chart library for cycling. It'll have a lot of the things I'm about to show you. And basically what this PMC is doing is I put a line in transition in the season. So here, because she was so just coming back from injury, this is when we were base and build are happening back here. Here's where the race season sort of kicked off. So we see we're build. We're coming out of a low CTL, build. You see, actually you can see a cycle, Getting up to about where, she's struggling to deal with the fatigue. We lay off a little preseason. Here you can see her baseline testing happening in here. We build. And the reality is what this chart is telling you, and I should have left the names up here. I start doing it in a couple of slides, but again, it's in the cycling pack. What this chart is doing is taking kind of a rolling weighted average, and it's creating what's known as what I call a chronic. So as soon as her CTL gets in the ranges to start generating green, that's where she's at breakthrough points. And then sure enough, look what happens. She does a little early season push. She races in here. She does a little early season. She starts laying off a little. Bam. She gets a nice little group of peaks. Then she's racing through the season. We do a little bit of rebuild because remember, our goal was late season performance and doing well in a late season event because we knew we had a lot of injury recovery to come back from here. And bam, she nails off here and here. Does really well, gets herself a nice new contract. Great. So good performance, good season. And we can see that there's a relationship happening here between a certain amount of training load and then a little bit of taper, not a lot, and it begins to trigger her peak performance event. So I might write the note relationship between training level and peak performance. Here there does seem to be a reasonably clear relationship. Here we see, long fatigue. She worked very hard to get back because we started so late. I mean, you can see here, that's February 21 right there. I mean, so definitely did a great job. This is not Jane Ryder. This is actually a different athlete, but it shows something really interesting, and it shows a unique PMC. This was built, I think, by Ivan and Donnie Key built this, and it's been floating around, but I don't think it's actually in the chart library. So again, if you email us, we can find this. What you're seeing here is somebody took that and adapted the chart, that one that I just showed you, which I built, and they used colors and transitions, the amount of TSB you have, to name these phases. So they call purple the transitional phase because you're very, very rested. Blue is your rested. Green is your fresh. So you notice that's floating on both sides of the line. That's when fatigue is low. Orange is fatigue. And red is risk injury. The main injury you're talking about there is some form of overreaching, or what I would more typically call some form of overtraining, which typically is non-functional overreaching. So that's a really interesting way to look at it. I don't use that, but it's an interesting process. But as you can see, what's interesting in this athlete, and the reason I showed it here, because it shows you what you should be looking for. Look at this. This goes back over time. This is 14, 15, 16, 17. So you're seeing a couple of years of data. This athlete was training way up here, laid off for a while, had an easier season, really laid off, came back, and then look at that cluster of peaks happening well below. So this person, you got to be careful. That green is the point where the load becomes chronic, where it's high. That's not always the best. So here you see it relates a little, but not really. And if a good coach was looking at this, you would start to see the hints right here. that this athlete was doing too much work, because look what happens when they really dropped off. So here you see a little more correlation. We don't have quite as much data with this athlete, or I'm not showing as much. I can look the same. But here you see that it's giving you a hint, isn't it? This athlete's probably training more than they need to. I'm not saying they're overtraining. They're probably in a non-functional overtraining, meaning they can still do the work, but they're doing too much work. They're not leaving enough energy in their system to recover and adapt well. And that was a hint to it. And I know this coach was smart enough to look at that and say, yep. And then she hired a new coach right in here. And that new coach said, here's what we're going to do. We'll just get you back to a little bit of shape, and then we're going to rest. And then we're not going to train way up there. We're going to train sort of in here. That's an excellent way to do a review. You see a smart person recreating success. When you're just looking at training, content would matter and stuff like that. I then have the same, I want to match a report and a chart all the time. As a matter of fact, it's something we're just working to continue to make more and more smooth and seamless in WKO. So you'll see improvements of this, later this year, early next year, the ability to make it more seamless and cleaner and simpler. So I have a training load chart. Again, if you email me, info@WKO4, we'll send it to you. So I'm looking at 2017 season, 2018 season. This is Jane Ryder. So the 17 season, remember, it was a little shorter because we were injured, but not really, because the injury started mid-season here and she had to lay off, as I'm going to show you. So it's a generally similar amount of time. So this is a totally different athlete, because what I'm about to show you is a little bit coincidental. But I reduced Jane Ryder's overall training load to improve her peaks. The reality was, and it wasn't so much the peak of her training load, it was she was training all the time. It was that perma-fit complex where you're just always sort of riding hard. We still put in a decent amount of miles in the rate. And remember, I'm just looking at the kind of training season. There's some other time I'm riding around, things like that. But you see it's closer to similar. The TSS is close. Kilojoules, though, and here's where you see TSS is close, but doesn't quite tell the full story. Kilojoules will add some other insight. And here I'm looking at kilojoules per hour and her average kilojoules per workout. So she was working out a little harder, right? And it was improving her ability to use, and it's a chicken and or egg, whether you say she was going harder for an hour, which means she was more capable of using energy, or because she was more capable of using energy, she was going harder for an hour. But it's directly related to the fact that she's burning more kilojoules. Enough people don't track that enough, or the 30, 40, 60-minute version of this that I showed you earlier. I showed you 30 and 60. Track it. It'll give you some insights into dose response. Here's the highest CTL of the year. So even though I reduced load, think about what you're thinking about, right? I reduced overall load, but I drove CTL higher. We went for a peak. We had to do well late season. We peaked. We pushed CTL higher. Here's her top minutes, but this is the average of the top 5. Something I'll often look at the average and not just one. And you can see across the board she got faster when you start doing the averages. Remember I told you she had some potentially faulty data in 2016. I don't know what I can trust, hence why I tend to average. Then I look at the training load as what was above 90 and above 105. It's funny, everybody says, why don't you put in below 90? Because really, or below 89, because that would be aerobic. This is kind of subthreshold, threshold. So you talk about aerobic energy, lactate, anaerobic. So I'm really showing time in those kind of ranges. I don't put below 90 because I just do the math in my head because it's 100%. So you can see here, I did more time above 90 and we raced a little more. It wasn't my intent to really do more time above 105, but it came out that way. But it was my intent to do more time in this time range. So, we trained a little harder. Most of the increase in intensity and where we picked up the kilojoules was mid-level, but we didn't have to train as many hours. We had less duration and distance. So insight. And you can look at this same breakdown by the same way I did it before. Look at your base build, whatever. It gives you insight. I don't want to keep doing that because I'll fall behind, but you get the idea. One of the things I always go back, and I keep this chart because it's so simple when you compare. Again, you command click different things. Here's 2017 season and 2016 season CTL compared. So the lighter blue is 17, and you can see her. I'm sorry, the lighter blue is 17. The purplish is 2016. I bet you can't quite see that color because that's why I'm tracing it. So she rested later. I mean, she had to kind of take some time off here in March, and then she tried to build her way back. And you can see where she started to get injury. She tried to push through it, and then she just couldn't. Where we were able to build, we had an appropriate rest. I didn't want to re-injure her. We built, we rested. We built. You know, it's each time I'm going a little higher, I'm feeling out what she can handle without creating injury. And then we did this final build, and our peaks come here. What I like about this is in compare mode, I'm seeing days at CTL where her CTL is above 90, 75, and oh wow, I took it out of this chart before I cut this picture. I was messing with it. I also like to look at days over 110. So I'd have to add that back. But I think you could see, it gives you some excellent insight. If I get days over 110, if I drew a line like right here, right, like right here, you can see the middle wise, I had, you know, in 17, I only had 214 days where she was over 75. She had 291 the year before. I only had 161 days over, or I had 195 days over 90 or 198. She had 161, and that's this bulk of time here leading into that peak. Now, if I had 110, obviously it would just be this little window where that was all she can achieve. So you would see different elevations of it. Sorry, I can't believe I took that out. I was taking the spaces out so it'd be easier to read. I also use cluster analysis, and again, all of these are in nothing. If it's new, I'm saying get it. Yeah, Eric, it's funny you said that. I must have grabbed a screenshot that was bad. Eric pointed out that I'm missing part of the season in that. He's saying you're missing the last part of the 2017 season. I am and I'm not, because the reality is that's I ended the season. So remember, I only looked at the end of the season. I think I ended the season at September 30th. So she had a Grand Fondo race, which basically she was kind of resting her way into. And that's when I stopped the data. Where the year before, I didn't stop at the same appropriate time because she started in November. So it's just a little bit of a way the calendar's laying it out. So back to clusters. Clusters are really important. I learned this from some pretty smart people, World Tour teams that uses this to predict form for their athletes. And I've found it to be very effective. I developed the analytic because they asked me to, not the idea. So this is a stolen idea, but I'll take credit for the ability to analyze it. Basically what you're seeing here is two CTLs. I'm comparing two seasons, 17 and 16. And again, you could do it by base build, whatever. I'm just showing ideas. I can see some peak performances. This is IF. So IF is going, this is a trend line of IF. So 2017, she's able to build throughout the year. The overall trend is going up in IF, where last year it was going down because she was injured mid-season. If you remember the PMC and the things you were saying, the CTL. But what I'm really looking at this chart is, and again, this is, I think it's called cluster analysis. Look it up in your library. I'm looking at mean max power for 20 minutes and mean max power for 5 minutes. Then I'm taking the mean max power top 5. So I'm averaging the top 5 and I'm creating a percentage of how close that is to the single maximum. And that's one of the definitions of form. So the ability to go, to have a high max and then to repeat it time and time again, that's a time frame of form. That cluster being very tight is a representation of good training equaling good form. Now, sometimes it's bad training equaling bad form because all the numbers are bad, don't get me wrong. So you have to still look at the main max number. But I know this team, when they felt they were picking athletes for Grand Tours, they wanted that person to be able to cluster at like 98%. I got to say, and they're smarter people than me, the only thing I don't like about that is if they're clustering that way before the Grand Tour, are they peaking too early? But that's not for me to decide. I still think it's an excellent metric. I look at that cluster by phases and against years. And basically what you're looking at both the 20 and the 5 minutes, she's improved her ability to cluster, but it's still not high enough. we had a short training season. We were cramming a lot of stuff in. The peak form was pretty good, but it wasn't great because she couldn't repeat. It wasn't a really solid peak. The type of peak, you go into a season and you spend a month, like 5 or 6 weeks, just winning everything or placing in everything that you tend to do. Um, you know, that comes when those cluster like 98. So that left us room to grow. So it's an insight for me. I walked away saying, got to improve that with her next year. Got to get that better. And then I did the same so you had 20-minute, you had 5-minute, and it's 60-minute. I'm doing the same analysis. And you can see she tends to be in the 95% range. Her form it was good and she peaked better, but it was never as good as it could have been. And that tells me she also has room to grow. This is Ed Jewel Rider. So just note, this is not the same rider. Because of that messed up data in 2016 she has, it doesn't make a great example. So the reality is what we're looking at here, and again, I'm looking at mean maximal power peak 20-minute versus CTL and TSB. And long story short, to keep us on schedule, these bright dots are the peak power outputs happening at a set TSS. I've shown this before, so I don't want to go deeply into it, but look at this chart. It'll tell you from all the TSS range that person has had a year, and this line is showing you the average where they tend to peak, which is funny, and I see it time and time again. The peak doesn't happen when their CTL is the highest, and then this is showing you the same relationship for TSB. Their TSB tends to be, look at that little cluster there, it gives me insight of what they'll peak at when it is this or that. I've shown this a couple of times, so I'm not going to go deeply into it, but I use it in all my reviews. It's a great tool. So let's talk about training content. That's another area I'll look at. Again, I'm presenting it linear, but it doesn't play this way. This is the new cycling library. If you're not using the cycling dashboard, it's a great place to start. I have selected in compare mode over here. I have 2017 and 2016 selected. Again, I could have done it base, build, and I probably should have put that example in, but I always run out of time. But you can compare base, build, race, and you can really start to see the differences of last year. So you don't really see it in these smaller charts. And of course, you could always click on a title and this will go full screen. But you do see it in these percentages if you can read it. Look how much time, even though, remember I was showing you she rode her bike a lot more. And I decreased the overall training duration, but increased the IF to some degree, the overall intensity, because all I was doing was eliminating her junk. I'll say it right here, I'll take heat for it. She was training under the 80-20 polarized way of training. Never works. You're looking at exact proof of everything you're looking at here again. I see it time and time again. 80-20 is a good strategy in a select window. It doesn't work as an overarching strategy, my opinion. Purely my opinion. I've seen it. I'm working with or have consulted with 4 or 5 athletes that have learned that painfully so. Because all I did was I eliminated that and I reapplied it here. So you really see that transition there, a little bit more here, and really not much change in these classic levels. And you can see the same if you look at it in eye levels. Move the junk out. I put things, in my opinion, in a more productive aerobic reality in this spot. We didn't do a ton of high-end stuff. Most of that was from racing. She needed threshold. She already had O'Killer. She has like a 580 watt 1 minute. And she weighs, $125. You wouldn't want to race that to the finish line, trust me. So we needed threshold. We needed to get her there. So you see where we were working. And even here, don't forget heart rate. Here you see the same reality. You can see where the junk miles were in heart rate. So simple time and zone. Don't forget the basics in doing these reviews. A lot of insight. You see now we're really gelling the story of Jane Ryder. I look at time and intensity. So again, I'm comparing 17 and 16. I'm just looking at the amount of time. Again, this is showing you 2017 season. It's 16 season. I upped her time. Again, it was an accident. She spent more time over 105 because she raced a little more because she wasn't injured. But over 90, that was the type of work. I did a lot of sub-threshold and threshold work with her because we needed threshold. don't overthink it. This is just heat mapping how each ride was going, but the reality is there's a lot of magic in there. So you're seeing the same story I'm building. Okay, this was good. What this does show me is when, right? You can definitely see that there's this build and then this classic pro kind of season. A lot of work done here, and then you're kind of flowing in. High volume rides. I always track high volume rides for multiple reasons. I don't know which is a bigger problem in the world. If you ask me on even days, on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I'll say I see too many riders that ride too many high volume. And then if you ask me on the odd days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, I guess, I would say they don't ride enough. And the reality is you got to be careful with high volume rides. It's important to have, particularly in a year that you're trying to break through or get to that next big level experience. But then you can't keep going to that well to some degree. Once you've gained a certain amount, let's call it efficiency, both gross mechanical, energy, muscular, metabolic, blah, 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 you don't have to do that much work to maintain it. And doing so might just create more fatigue. So I want to know the answer. So all I did here was take average duration of rides. You can see our duration per ride. So we rode less, but a little bit more in the average ride. Number of rides over 4 hours. And I actually had, our 2017 had 3 more. So no big change there. Rides over 4 hours pedaling, right? You can ride 4 hours, but if you train in altitude, go train in the Alps for 2 months. And the amount of time you spend pedaling isn't going to match the amount of time you're out there. So I track that too. You notice a dramatic reduction, right? Look, she's mountain training. She's spending too much time coasting, which sometimes is good and sometimes isn't. And then I also look at rides over 2,500 kilojoules for her because she's a little lighter and that makes sense. So that gives me some insight into the big rides. The visuals tell me when. So here, but you definitely see by race season, she's racing and it's come down. It's interesting to lay peaks over this. You often get insight into fatigue. I probably could have done that for you. The reality is too many long rides, particularly when they're compacted into a time range, often the athlete has to back off for a while. Long rides are really good for raising muscular endurance. They actually are good for raising VO2 max, a range of things. Not the most effective, but good. But the reality is there's a lot of fatigue that follows them and you need to deal with that. Next, I think I named this chart here. So there it is, season review, MFTP, FRC versus IF. And this might be the busiest chart I've ever shown in a presentation, but what I do with my charts is I've gotten used to looking at them, so I combine a lot of data in one chart because I can see it fast and it works for me. So Lucas, good question. I'm going to come back to that in a moment because I have some specialty. So, and as you guys notice, I'm trying to answer your questions without like pointing out I'm answering your question, but hopefully if I'm getting it, if I don't answer your question, ask me again. What I'm looking at in this chart is purple is IF, right? Orange is MFTP, and this is 2017 season. You can see it up here. The red dots are intensity factor, IF. The red line is the trend of intensity factor through the season. So the trend is we're riding with more intensity. Yellow is duration of rides, and the yellow line is duration trend. So this probably at a novice coach, at a self-coached athlete, at myself, because I don't have the discipline. I'm not really training for anything, but I do it, what I'm about to say. What we tend to do through the season that's a mistake is you get through the winter base, you start getting ready to race and you increase intensity and the weather is nice and you're kind of getting out and you're riding harder and harder through the summer and hanging out and doing group rides with your buddies and killing it. But what we tend to do is we then have the yellow line, the duration also going up, right? When both those lines are going up, I rarely ever see peak performance. Rarely ever see, the targeted peak performance. The reality is there's phases when that makes sense, base and even maybe build to some degree, but there's a point that those lines need to diverge. They need to go different directions because you have to replace the intensity with the reduction of duration or the athlete will be too fatigued to adapt and respond really well to the exercise stimuli that you're applying. Now comes the busy chart. So what I did is I laid 16 and 17, but as Eric pointed out earlier, they're not the same time range, and you have to think because of that, it's like the end of one season is sort of over here. But if you could just, it's really hard to see. Here's the red line from 17 going up. Here's the yellow line. It's green here because the way I chose it, going down. 2016, look what was happening. The intensity line was going down, and because she was injured and couldn't ride more intensely, her and her coach decided to replace it with duration, which then results got worse and worse. She wasn't introducing enough stimuli to continue to improve response, and she was injured. She should have just rested. She should have just stopped. But the reality is the solution was to keep trying to do, remember, she was 80-20 training. I'm not bashing it, but it gives you insight. And she just couldn't do it. She couldn't maintain the intensity, so they just did more. When what you're doing doesn't work, be really careful of let's just do it more as an answer. Usually a bad idea. And there's the name, season review, MFTP, FRCIF chart. Now, here I did what I said earlier, right? And it really is telling if you do this and spend a little time looking at it. Because it really, if you can read it. So what I did here is I held down command, and I collect base, build, race. And some of these are too short, so the FRC, the way I broke it up, it's the FRC isn't calculating, but I'm really looking at IF and trend anyway. So here you see duration in base, right? Here you see it flatter in build. It's going down a little bit, and the overall is going down more. Here you can see what's happening with the intensity in base. We're not pushing intensity. It's actually going down. One of the first things I did was I had to spend a month stopping her from going so hard. I had to tell her one more time, don't ride so far above the prescription. I was going to scream. And then in base and build, you can see it. We're coming back up. We're back to that nice natural trend. Now I sent her this and I was like, remember when you used to make this mistake and you just wanted to ride hard? Because I convinced her by showing her the previous year's data, stop doing that or you're just going to replicate the same result and potentially replicate the injury. So interesting way to use the chart. Dose response performance. Here's a classic. It's in all the reports. This is just trend relationship management, MFTP, TTE, set FTP, FRC, Pmax, VO2 max. So all these are on that same chart, and we can see how they change in the same relationship. What do you see out of Jane Ryder? Okay, she gets back into it. You can see she started to ride her bike a little bit. She was stuck on a kind of trainer device, blah, blah, blah. She gets outside. She starts training. She actually goes down a little. Bam. We get to a point where she can finally test and really go hard. We see the step up. But then we see, and it's actually hard to see here, she's increasing all season long. But what's interesting about her, because she's responding to everything, right? So the overall FRC average versus last year looks down, but look what was happening as we were training. The build and the content was impactful across the board. So this was the type of deal you look back and say what you did in general was effective. And you need to really say, I want to repeat a lot of that. But there's a confusing assumption here that I want to point out. And then I don't have that many more slides to go, but I'll teach you something interesting here, which you might know, or those of you who don't will learn something new. The thing here is, right, you talk about this athlete. We knew that she was improving her power at 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and 40 minutes, and 60-minute MP, right? Well, the reality was, if you looked at this quickly, you would say, well, that's because her MFTP, her FTP, her aerobic capacity was going up. But so was her anaerobic, the green, her FRC was going up, so it was a combination of the two. And it'd be easy to make that assumption. But always remember, and I was preaching this last week, and I stole Hamish's little chart, which Lucas, I think then you linked somebody linked the article, or was it Dave, how really at FRC, your anaerobic work capacity builds on top your aerobic. And then I showed this because she is the perfect example. So all I'm doing here is I'm showing you a power duration breakdown. This is the FTP contribution chart. So again, it's on all the packs. And I'm just looking at 17 and 16 season, and I'm holding the line at 20 minutes. But she has an FTP and stuff like that. So you can just see what's happening here, right? So the red line and the orange line, that's her power duration curve. The red is 17, the orange is 16. You notice there's a little bit of difference here. It actually dips under, right there. But then look, in 2017, you can really see it distancing 2016 as we go out here. Well, we set out to improve threshold and aerobic capability underneath that, and we certainly did, right? She already has enough anaerobic capacity. If I showed you this, she's at world class right in here for a female, at world class. So she already can do that. But what we're also seeing, let's look at the contribution. So the purple and the blue, this is her anaerobic. I made the names really simple. This is her anaerobic. So you can see 2016 is actually stronger, the purple, than 2017, which is the blue. So we gave up some anaerobic capability. But here you see her aerobic ability is the bright green is 2017 and the aqua green is 2016. But she gained all of her time, everything outside of 1 minute, beyond, I'd say about 120, where those kind of cross. And it's never this exact, it's a model. But look at all of that gain, it all came aerobically. And if I actually look at the contribution difference to FTP, anaerobically, last year at 20 minutes, this is where I'm holding the cursor, she had, and that's 20 minutes, 16 of those watts were occurring anaerobically in 2016 versus 15. So she gave up 1 watt. But look at the gain of the aerobic contribution to that, 248 watts versus 267. And don't get me wrong, again, it's a model. There's a plus or minus of 1.4. You could look in the, and see how much plus minus you have in the chart with error calculations. But the reality is that gives you excellent insight, right? So I go back to my athlete and said, look, I told you, we need to move off the anaerobic and give aerobic, and you'll be faster, you'll race better, you'll perform. We see this series of things saying we did an aerobic effort. Remember all the content you were seeing, all that effort in that 90% kind of range and that threshold, sub-threshold pyramid style training. You see it paid. At least it paid an improvement. Did it pay enough or cost benefit and all those other things? That's the price of focus. And you as a coach have to decide what's the best absolute focus. But you can certainly see her gain. So one of the questions I had, and you could do this, right? Run this by base build. As a matter of fact, what I often do when I really get complex is I'll run 2016 base versus 2017 base, 2017 build versus 2008. They're not always the same exact time frame, but the same general focus. So I got a question, do you look at the differences and variances over the course of the season? Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing here, right? I'm actually looking at, but I'm generalizing by phases. You could do it by months if you wanted. But I think it's important once you adapt a good season, the goal setting process with the measurement metrics and the season review are all the same points, right? Decide what points you're going to track them throughout all the year, and the review is easy to complete. It's not always great. You might have failed at everything, you might have succeeded at everything, but it's clear. So yeah, and then I look through the year because I know if I know what I have the goal and I have the measurements and the things we need to accomplish to be correct. I'm also tweaking. That's why compliance isn't always that important to me. I'm also tweaking to adjust to try to achieve our milestones so that at the end of the year we could do a good review, right? That's what we all want. I mean, I'm doing it so they win, but you get the point. So look, what I am seeing though with all this aerobic gain is, let's dig a little deeper. So here's a very simple chart. It's kind of cool, but again, it's a model and a soft metric. So I'll say that up front. But when you look at it this season, this tells a very interesting story. All I'm looking at here are the purple dots, her VO2 max, her modeled VO2 max per day. The purple dash is a trend line. The blue dots are her efficiency, her aerobic efficiency. And the blue dash is the trend line of her aerobic efficiency. So where was she getting her gain, her aerobic? I hate the word efficiency. Andy points it out, and he's right. It should be some other aerobic word because efficiency makes us think gross mechanical efficiency. We're talking about her aerobic efficiency, and that's improving And if you could actually see it as well, it's actually improving even faster. So the VO2 max improvement was the driver, but this angle is steeper. I could do a report that measures the angle. I just don't, because then I get too precise. I find myself falling for the trap of over precision, but you can visually see it. Most of her gain was coming from aerobic. Her cardiovascular system was improving. We were raising the roof of its capability to a point higher than ever before, which you're going to see in the next slide, because we were pushing it up underneath. So we'd raise the roof, get tall, raise the roof, get tall, raise the roof. If you guys saw that webinar, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now what's really good bad for her is now, though, when we look at that, so here's our VO2 max starting. This is the 2000, so here you see the season, but I went further back in the display. So I'm kind of doing a version of highlight. So this is where she was kind of dropped off last year. So it was like, here was the performance. She had a little carryover number, dropped off. We rested. We started to rest here. We had to go slow because we're on a trainer. We couldn't go hard, blah, blah, blah. We finally go hard. The red line is her VO2 max. You see it improving. And what we're measuring underneath is her MFTP and her MFTP, the green line, is a percentage. Oh my goodness, it didn't count. I'm sorry, I got to be so careful that when I do the screenshot, sometimes it doesn't show. The reality is we only got to about 81%. We only were able to raise her threshold about 81% of her VO2 max. That tells us a lot of room to grow for this athlete. And then, because I do have it here, I'm almost done, I promise. There's no way I could do a short webinar. You guys should just tell me to surrender. If you look at, now I'm just overlaying them again, 17 and 16. So orange, you see her 2016 VO2 max, right? And she was building, and this purple is her CTL. Look, her CTL goes way up here early in the year, and that's February. And her VO2 max peaks all the way here, and then she just can't sustain it. She gets injured, or was she injured? There's a story behind it. And then here she just can't train anymore, and we see it drop off. We, working together, go a little slower. We take away useless fatigue. I guess I don't have a better word for it. I'm not trying to be mean, but it was just riding your bike for the sake of riding your bike. And we are able to slowly, but more to a higher point, grow her VO2 max. So most of her driving response was cardiovascular, her aerobic efficiency, her VO2 max. We were doing that. But the reality is where again, in the house expression that I showed you before, hopefully everybody's seen that webinar, we failed. She never really gets beyond about 81.8% MFTP of VO2 max. I like to get that close to 85% for a pro, 84, 85 for a category cyclist, 88, 87. I've seen one or two people get to 90. When you have a really high natural VO2 max, it's hard because other fatigue factors will stop you. So a lot of my diagnostics with her is finding out why we couldn't close that. But I've already eliminated cardiovascular. We had good improvements. The VO2 max ceiling was clearly growing, but the FTP was really just coming up with the VO2 max. I couldn't close the gap with her. There was something else holding that back, which I know the answer and we'll take a look at in a minute. And then here I can see the difference in the VO2 max, power at VO2 max, other factors. It's all down here. It's all, and this is just the VO2 max pack for biking. Again, I'm not trying not to introduce a lot. I'm trying to show you what we have because I use it. I wrote a lot of it. So quick view of fatigue resistance is she drops off with a decent amount of fatigue. After 1500 kilojoules, she's losing almost 30 watts at 20 minutes, and she's losing 50 plus watts at 5 minutes. Some of that's because we couldn't test part of the year when we can go hard. She has a fatigue resistance problem, so I'll skip to the end in the name of time. The one place we couldn't, we were able to improve the cardiovascular side, but we haven't developed her gross mechanical efficiency and her muscular metabolic fitness, probably is the right word for it, to be able to sustain that. So we have room to grow. Now we've made the roof taller, but we didn't grow as tall in the house as we could. So this year we're more focused on growing as tall in the house as we could. We're going to improve the aerobic and the muscular metabolic engine until she can grow no more. Then we'll raise the VO2 max and then go to our second build. So much of this, she was just gaining aerobic efficiency and improving her VO2 max. It was just pulling everything forward. And next year, we're going to have to work a little harder to get it. We're going to have to be a little more astute and sharper. So another check mark in the insight is, we didn't get that like I wanted. I would love to see that at 85, because that's a nice improvement, by the way. Going from 81.5 to 84 will dramatically improve her threshold power. So fatigue resistance, that is a factor. We got to stop her from fading. We made some progress this year, but the season was too short. It really was. There was too many things to try to squeeze in. Her fatigue over an hour, she does okay, but as you can see, just see points where she dramatically starts to drop off. We train a lot of 20s, so I'm somewhat creating that same 20-minute disease I preach against. But she wasn't athletically mature enough to get there. So next year, a lot of the mid work, where 20s, we're doing 4 times 15, 3 times 20. Next year, we're going to be a lot more 2 times 30s, 2 times 40s, and in high tempo, sweet spot, things like that. Okay. That's it. There is another resource, you guys. As you know, there's always an educational page. There's ebooks and links to all the previous webinars everybody could watch there and go through. I think I've nailed every pre-question, but if you have closing questions, charts, whatever, questions about the recovery, if you aren't asleep by now is the time that you can ask them. If you want the charts, email us at info@wkl4.com. What I don't want to do is keep loading all my personal charts to the library, because we're just making clutter. We're going to try to clean that out here in the next month. But Debbie will email them to you if you email there. So I'm going to stop. I'll give it a couple of minutes of quiet time to take questions. Maybe I answer them as we go. Well, it's not quiet time. I'll keep talking at you. This will be recorded and posted. If you ask Debbie for the presentation, when you send to info@wkl4.com, she will send you the presentation also if you want it. So Lucas, good question. Sorry, I did not come back to that. Do you track rides training separately from races and reviews, duration, MMP, MP after? I do and I don't. In a season review, I do, in the sense of tracking it as performance, but when I'm tracking training, I leave it in there. One of the things that I struggle with, and I believe is almost not solvable, is at a pro level, and I don't work with any category cyclists anymore. At a pro level, once you're in season, you can't test. You just don't have this opportunity to create maximals, as you know. And it's hard. So it's like I go back and forth, going back and forth mentally about, wow, do I take it out? But the reality is, because so much of the peak actually happens because, I think even last year in injury season, she raced, a pretty good chunk of time. I do separate it though when I look at peak and when I do a performance analysis. So I do tag race and I don't tag training days, I tag race days, so that oftentimes I'll pull out race performance. And there's just certain things I never see in race performance go the other way. Just to fully answer the question, I rarely ever see a longer than 20-minute peak in race performance, and seeing something like a 20 or whatever is reasonably rare also, because it's just not the environment for that type of performance. I have seen where that's happened though, absolutely. It's, so it's good to look at in that way. Yes, thank you. You're welcome. Really appreciate you guys using WKL4 and attending. Just to remark, amazing athlete. Yeah, Matt, it's funny. She came up in a federation system that just didn't do a good job. If somebody would have figured her out when she was 17, 18, she would be a hammer right now. But she got into a lot of years of bad training, and now it's got some chronic injuries and some overtraining in her history. So it's going to take 2 more years probably to bring her back to the level she could be. Always thinking long-term cycles, it's a shame. Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for attending. We'll get the recording up as soon as we can. Have a great night. Bye now.